mother's scream that changed everything. A mother's scream stopped Bumpy Johnson in the middle of the street. It was 2 a.m., April 25th, 1964, in Harlem. Bumpy was walking home from Small's Paradise, where he had just finished a meeting with union men about protecting sanitation workers from mob shakedowns. The night was cool, the streets were quiet, and Bumpy was tired. He was 59 years old, newly released after 11 years in Alcatraz, and every bone in his body reminded him he wasn't 30 anymore. Then he heard a woman's voice, raw with grief, echoing off the brownstones of 135th Street. Not just crying, but wailing. The kind of sound that comes from a mother watching her child being taken away forever. Most gangsters would have kept walking. This wasn't mob business. It wasn't about territory, respect, or money. It was just another black kid being railroaded by the system, a system that had been doing that since before Bumpy was born. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most gangsters. He stopped, turned around, and walked toward the sound. Ruth Robinson stood outside the 28th precinct, Sunday dress soaked with rain and tears. She was 42 years old, a housekeeper who worked 3 jobs to keep her family afloat. Her hand shook as she clutched a crumpled arrest warrant. Bumpy approached carefully. In Harlem, you didn't just walk up to a crying woman without announcing yourself. That was how you got maimed or worse. "Ma'am," Bumpy said softly, keeping his distance. "Are you all right?" Ruth looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't recognize him at first. Then she noticed the hat, the tailored coat, the way he carried himself like a man who owned the ground he walked on. You're Bumpy Johnson," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth collapsed against the precinct wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold concrete. "They're killing my baby," she sobbed. "They're going to kill my Marcus for something he didn't do." Bumpy knelt beside her, ignoring the sharp pain in his knees. "Tell me what happened." Ruth Robinson told him a story that would make Bumpy Johnson risk everything he had built since getting out of Alcatraz. Her son, Marcus Robinson Jr., was 19 years old. He had the mind of a child, what they called slow back then. 2 nights earlier, he had been walking home from his job at a grocery store in Brooklyn when 2 white detectives picked him up for questioning. They said a white woman named Sarah Bennett had been murdered in Manhattan, stabbed 57 times in her Upper East Side apartment. Her roommate, Lisa Carter, had been killed too. The newspapers called it the Career Girl Murders, and the whole city demanded justice. The cops needed someone to blame. And Marcus Robinson, a black kid with no alibi and no money for a lawyer, was perfect. They kept him in interrogation for 22 hours straight. No food, no water, no lawyer. They told him they would kill his mother if he didn't confess. They showed him photos of the crime scene and told him to describe what he'd done. Terrified and confused, Marcus eventually signed a confession. He couldn't even read what he was signing. Now he was being held without bail, charged with double murder, and the district attorney was demanding the death penalty. But he wasn't even in Manhattan that day. Ruth cried. He was in Brooklyn. His boss saw him. His friends saw him. But nobody will listen because he's black and they're white, and that's all that matters. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "Ma'am, give me 2 weeks. If your son is innocent, I'll prove it. And if someone set him up, they'll wish they hadn't." Ruth stared at him. "Why would you help us? You don't even know my boy." Bumpy stood, his knees cracking like gunshots. "Because I know what it's like to be locked up for something you didn't do. I spent 11 years in Alcatraz, and half the men in there were innocent. The only difference between them and your son is that nobody with power cared enough to save them." He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and pressed it into her hand. "Go home. Get some sleep. I'll be in touch." "But how?" "I have my ways with that." Bumpy Johnson disappeared into the Harlem night. What Ruth Robinson didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Bumpy Johnson had just made a promise that would put him at war with the NYPD, the Genovese crime family, and the entire Manhattan District Attorney's Office. But that was exactly how Bumpy liked it. The next morning, Bumpy caught a meeting in the back room of a soul food joint on Lenox Avenue where he held court. He invited 3 people: Frank Lucas, his young protege 34, ambitious, hungry to prove himself, would do the legwork; Nat Pettigrew, a former cop kicked off the force for refusing to take bribes, knew how the NYPD worked from the inside; and Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary numbers queen. She was in her 70s now, but still had connections everywhere: judges, lawyers, journalists. If you needed information in Harlem, you went to Queenie. Bumpy laid out the situation. Marcus Robinson didn't kill those women, but someone wants the world to think he did. I need to know why. Frank spoke first. Boss, with all due respect, why do we care? This ain't our business. Bumpy's eyes went cold. Frank, when a black kid gets railroaded for a crime he didn't commit, it is our business. Because today, it's Marcus Robinson. Tomorrow, it's you, or me, or any of us. The system doesn't care if you're guilty. It just needs someone to blame. Frank nodded. Chastened. Stephanie leaned forward. What do you need, Bumpy? 3 things. 1. I need to know who really killed those women. 2. I need to know which cops are covering it up. 3. I need proof Marcus Robinson was nowhere near Manhattan that day. Nat whistled. That's a tall order. The NYPD's already closed the case. They're not reopening it just because we asked nicely. Then we won't ask nicely, Bumpy said. Frank Lucas started with the crime scene. He couldn't get into the apartment. It was sealed, but he talked to the doorman, the neighbors, the mailman, everyone who had been in the building the day Sarah, Bennett, and Lisa Carter were killed. He found something interesting. The doorman, a Polish immigrant named Anton Kowalski, remembered seeing a white man leaving the building around the time of the murders. The man was covered in blood, wearing an expensive suit. He got into a black Cadillac and drove away. Did you tell the police? Frank asked. Anton shook his head. They didn't ask. They only wanted to know if I saw any black men. Frank's blood boiled, but he kept his cool. Can you describe this man? Anton could. Tall, dark hair, a scar on his left cheek, late 30s. Frank took the description back to Bumpy while Frank was working the crime scene. Nat Pettigrew was working his old contacts in the NYPD. He found out something that made Bumpy's skin crawl. The lead detective on the Bennett Carter case was Detective Frank Sullivan. Sullivan was dirty. Everyone knew it. He was on the Genovese family payroll, taking bribes to look the other way when mob guys committed crimes. But here's where it got interesting. Sullivan had a partner, a guy named Johnny Scar Mancini. Johnny wasn't a cop. He was a burglar, a junkie, and he had a scar on his left cheek. Nat dug deeper. Johnny Mancini had been arrested 3 times in the past year for burglary. Each time, Detective Sullivan got him released. Sullivan's protecting this guy, Nat told Bumpy, and I think Mancini is the one who killed those women. Bumpy's jaw tightened. So Sullivan framed Marcus Robinson to protect his mob buddy. That's my guess. Then we need to find Johnny Mancini. Finding Johnny Mancini wasn't easy. He was hiding. But Frank Lucas had connections in the drug world, and junkies talk. It took 3 days, but Frank tracked Mancini to a shooting gallery on the Lower East Side. Mancini was high out of his mind. Barely conscious, Frank dragged him into a back alley. Bumpy was waiting. Johnny Mancini, Bumpy said quietly. Mancini blinked, trying to focus. Who are you? I'm the man who's going to give you a choice. You can tell me the truth about Sarah Bennett and Lisa Carter, or I can turn you over to the people who want you dead. Mancini started crying. I didn't mean to kill them. I was just there to rob the place, but they woke up and started screaming, and I panicked. So you stabbed them 57 times? I was high. I don't even remember most of it. Sullivan said he'd protect me if I kept quiet. Bumpy pulled out a tape recorder. Say that again? All of it. For 45 minutes. Johnny Mancini confessed everything on tape: how he broke into the apartment, how he killed the women in a drug-fueled rage, how Detective Sullivan helped him cover it up by framing Marcus Robinson when it was over. Bumpy had everything he needed, but there was one problem. The tape alone wouldn't be enough. The courts could claim it was coerced. He needed corroboration. That's when Stephanie St. Clair came through. She'd been working her contacts in the legal world and found a lawyer willing to take Marcus Robinson's case pro bono. His name was David Coleman, a young, idealistic civil rights attorney, fresh out of Columbia Law School. Coleman listened to the tape. His eyes went wide. "This is explosive," he said, "but we need more. We need witnesses who can place Marcus somewhere else that day." "I'm working on that," Bumpy said. Frank Lucas went back to Brooklyn. He found Marcus's boss at the grocery store, a man named Mr. Park. Mr. Park confirmed that Marcus had been working all day on April 23rd, the day of the murders. "Why didn't you tell the police?" Frank asked. Mr. Park looked down. "They never asked, and I'm Korean. Who would believe me?" Frank also found 3 of Marcus's friends who had been with him that evening. All of them confirmed Marcus's alibi. Bumpy now had everything: the confession, the alibi, and proof of police corruption. On May 10, 1964, Bumpy Johnson walked into the Manhattan District Attorney's office with David Coleman, the tape recording, and affidavits from Marcus's alibi witnesses. The DA listened to the tape. His face went white. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," Bumpy said. "What matters is you have an innocent kid on death row and the real killer walking free because one of your detectives is corrupt." The DA stared at Bumpy for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me Detective Sullivan now." Marcus Robinson was released on May 15, 1964. The charges were dropped. Johnny Scar Mancini was arrested and eventually convicted of the murders. Detective Frank Sullivan was never charged. He had too many friends in high places, but he was quietly forced to retire. Ruth Robinson threw her arms around Bumpy Johnson outside the courthouse and sobbed into his chest. "You saved my boy's life." Bumpy just nodded. "That's what we do in Harlem, ma'am. We protect our own." Marcus Robinson lived a quiet life after that. He never forgot what Bumpy Johnson did for him. He named his first son Ellsworth Bumpy's real first name in honor of the man who gave him a second chance. Harlem never forgot. Either what happened with Marcus Robinson became legend in Harlem. Not in the newspapers. They never printed stories about gangsters doing good, but in the streets, in the barbershops, in the churches. People told the story of how Bumpy Johnson saved an innocent life. It proved something the system didn't want people to know, that sometimes the criminals have more honor than the cops. That sometimes justice comes from the streets, not the courtroom. Bumpy Johnson never talked about what he did for Marcus Robinson. When reporters asked him about it years later, he just shrugged and said, "I did what any man with a conscience would do, But everyone who knew the truth understood. Bumpy Johnson didn't just save one life that spring of 1964. He reminded Harlem that someone was still looking out for them, that even when the system failed, even when the cops and the courts and the politicians turned their backs, there was still one man who gave a damn, and his name was Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and smash that like. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about real heroes, and drop a comment below. Have you ever stood up for someone when nobody else would? Let me know. And don't forget to turn on notifications for more untold stories of Black history's most legendary figures.